Welcome to Everyday Torah. Me and Gary are back with you. We are going to start on who wrote the book of Hebrews. I'm going to call it part 3A because we already know that this particular presentation is going to be a bit longer. I'll break it probably about in the middle. The subtitle here for Gary is Results of Modern Computational Analysis. So if you're not the geek out type, this is probably not the video for you. But if you're about ready to geek out on a bunch of stuff with regard to who wrote the book of Hebrews, why it's important, then you've landed in the right spot. So good morning, Gary.
Good morning to you.
I think we're all grateful for the hard nerd out work that you do. Because, some of us can't nerd out quite like you do, but we love watching it and seeing how it all plays out. So what's today about?
Yeah, in fact, I really love this stuff. So you'll have to kind of rein me in if I'm getting overboard, but I'll try to keep it within reason.
Well, I think we like thoroughness.
Yeah.
And hey, if you don't know and you're watching or listening, Gary has a background in physics, statistical analysis.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, yeah.
Absolutely.
You've got to be precise, right?
Yeah. And I did it in a field called high energy physics, which is known for statistical analysis. I mean, very, very extensive kind of analyses that are done in that field. So I sort of got my weaning, if you will, in science doing this kind of stuff. So now, not working on this particular type of problem, because when we talk about textual analysis, that's a little different beast than the kinds of things that I've worked with. However, there are a lot of similarities, and there are enough similarities that even in reading the paper, I could get a lot of it from first reading, know what they were doing and why they were doing what they were doing. So it's something I'd like to delve into, by the way, further when I have the time. Time is the enemy here, but I would love to dig into this analysis, because looking at this paper that we're going to discuss in some detail, I've really became aware of the possibilities, of further work. And I might mention some of those at the very end when we get done that might be able to be done. And so we'll have a chance to kind of, talk, like you said, about a lot of details. There'll be some details, but I'm going to try to give a broad brush stroke on some things just because of our time, but to give the viewer enough information that as we get into particularly looking at the data from this analysis, that they'll have a little better feeling for it, handle on it than they would otherwise have. So.
Yeah, in that regard, just your background in physics and data analysis, I think a lot of people, when I tell them, so when I was doing PhD work in theology, one of the major theories that I worked with was in the field of cognitive anthropology, and they're just like, what? Why would you do that? And I want to say, you want us to handle the scriptures with all the astuteness that in any field, we want to be very precise. And it's not like in textual criticism, not everything is, I even shudder to say this, not everything is of the Spirit. Now, I want the Spirit informing me.
Yes.
But the thing is, I've seen people say, well, I got this download from the Spirit, but just a reading of the text and being critical of it, I'm like, I don't think you got that from the Spirit. You kind of made that up in Lululand or something like that.
Yes.
So you and I both, I think we want to send this message is we both want to be led of the Spirit. Both want to be sensitive to the Spirit as we are reading the scriptures, but at the same time, being led of the Spirit doesn't mean we check our brains out at the door.
Right.
And the Apostle Paul certainly did not do that.
No, he certainly did not.
Well,
he was a widely and well-educated man, actually, and understood a lot of things for his day and age. I'm convinced of that. He's a remarkable individual, I think, historical individual, let alone.
Sure.
I mean, just for his intellect, let alone for the impact that he had on world history through his teachings.
Right. There's no doubt that the books that he wrote are inspired by Yahweh. But at the same time, the intellectual arguments he's making from the Torah and just borrowing from some of the cultural milieu.
Yes.
He's weaving these things together masterfully.
Yes.
I know that. Everyone knows that. but
Yes.
that's part of the things that we actually do think about as we study Paul.
Amen.
All right. Again, the floor is yours.
All right. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at this analysis of this paper. I trust you have the paper posted. I think you mentioned to me that you had it posted. It's about a decade old now. But the one thing I wanted to comment before jumping into the subject at hand is just to mention that this is an area that I'm kind of excited about, because for the first time, and I think this field is probably, I don't know when it started, but I'm guessing something in the neighborhood of a couple decades ago, maybe or so, or maybe even before that, as computational methods reached a certain level where you could easily do this kind of analysis. And I use easily in quotes because it's not an easy problem. It's a lot of work to do this, but at least it's computationally possible to do it now, and that's the thing that's exciting. And you think about, as you alluded to, the discussions of canonicity, the discussions of authors of books, and you and I both know some of the discussions over the centuries on some of this stuff has been very qualitative, and I'll be somewhat circumspect about my language, because you probably can sense that I don't have necessarily a high opinion of a lot of it. Some of it is very good, but a lot of it I think is not very good in this area. But now we have the possibility of taking what is inherently, when you talk about matching authors to unknown texts, and you're getting into author style and things of this nature, you're talking about something that's pretty qualitative, pretty subjective, and so that already lends itself to, a wide variety of opinions, and what is the real value of a lot of these opinions is up in the air. But then you combine it with the fact that you're dealing with ancient texts in this case, which you don't have a lot of material. So it's subjective, and the amount of material is very limited. Now that's a brew. When you put those two things together, now you're dealing with a tremendous amount of uncertainty. You really are. And sadly, the people that deal in this area do not realize how uncertain their statements really are. And so what we can do now is we can actually look at author style. And this is one of the big challenges of doing this kind of work, is you first have to determine, well, when you talk about author style, what is important about author style? What are the critical elements of author style that you could actually use to separate one author from another and distinguish them? And are those things quantitative? Not qualitative, not subjective, but objective, quantitative data. And so what this method is doing is it's showing us that the answer to that question is yes. There are things about author style that are very quantitative, can be quantified, and can be analyzed. This is exciting. This is very exciting, because now we don't have to rely on subjective analysis and people's opinions. We can actually get down to the heart of what distinguishes one author from another. And when sufficient data exists, we can even get down to pinpointing down to like probabilities at a very good level as to whether a given author could have authored this text or not.
Gary, I can feel all the qualitative researchers rustling right now. And you come from,
so they should.
Well, so I'm a qualitative research guy. You're a quantitative research guy. And even though I would say, hey, look, we have a method. There are things that we follow. We are very strict. We use coding and
sure, I know that.
But at the same time, I'm going to say, even from a qualitative standpoint, if there is quantitative research, the availability, the tools to do that, and if it strengthens the case, we're all for it.
Yes, we are.
In fact, it's a better thing if it's immediately observable. So if you're qualitative, get over it. I mean, this is a good thing to have.
That's right. All right. Definitely.
Yeah, for sure.
And I do feel actually that in the future, this method shows enough promise that it probably will become more and more on people's radar screen. It'll become something more and more that people will be talking about and looking at as a way of doing textual analysis. So with that introduction, then the problem of interest for us today is, of course, focused. We're focused on trying to determine from a set of authors in this case, in this analysis, drawn largely from the New Testament, so New Testament authors, where it's possible, and some early second century sources as well, to test against the book of Hebrews. So the book of Hebrews has a characteristic that's fixed. You know, we can do an analysis on it and determine certain things about it, and it's basically not going to change. You know, so it's a fixed animal, right? No matter what, we're not going to probably ever find a lot of information that's going to change the standard very much. Although on the authors, of course, we could get changes if new material is discovered by those authors, right? Every time we discover new works anciently, technically that gets thrown in the data pool, and that could alter the picture for that particular author. So the authors could change, but here again, the likelihood even of that is remote. It's not impossible, but it is remote. So this whole process of what I call quantitative assessment is key. Quantitative assessment is what we're looking for. And what we're looking for is to try to link up an author's style by looking at some particular characteristics of that style that can be quantified, actually put into numbers, if you will, and then analyzed against the book of Hebrews. That's sort of the general picture of what we're trying to do here. And we want to do this for a whole set of authors. Okay, now, if I say it just, that's the simplified version of the process, but it doesn't stop there, because if it was that simple, it'd probably be easily accomplished, right? Relatively speaking. I mean, once you decide on the criteria, it'd be pretty much a relatively easy thing to do if it was just that simple. But it's not that simple. It turns out there's other aspects of this analysis that you have to go through to ensure that you really are measuring what you think you are measuring.
Okay.
And the methods for doing that part of it are actually quite sophisticated. In fact, in general, statistical analysis and statistical reasoning is very sophisticated reasoning. It really is. And it's a form of reasoning that more people should be at least somewhat familiar with, particularly in a society we live in today, where the whole society is data-driven on almost every level.
True.
And yet people don't understand data. So you can imagine they're walking around kind of clueless about a lot of things that they probably should know more about, you know. And so I won't get on this soapbox here, but maybe another time, that I think statistical analysis should be an indispensable part of everybody's education at some level, because of just the world we live in increasing.
Sure. Yeah, it's subversively happening to you all the time.
All the time. All the time. Yeah. You know, that old saying, right? There are lies, damnable lies, and then there's statistics. Right. And the reason for that has nothing to do with statistics, because statistics properly understood and properly used by a competent person who knows what they're doing, and they're trying to be faithful with the use of it, they don't lie. They never lie. They can't lie. It's impossible for that to lie. But if you have nefarious elements and agendas entering into the equation and driving people's, you know, their perspective on these problems, then it is possible for people to manipulate the background, to which most of us are unaware of, right? We're not aware of all the background that goes into framing those statistics, and they can present a very false narrative. So this kind of thing is really important, I think, more important than people realize, for us as individuals, and actually for the nation going forward. So that's our problem in a nutshell. And we're going to be talking about it's called an automated authorship analysis is the technical term for it. And in this first part, we're going to be, as you mentioned just a moment ago, we'll be talking largely about the method, the first half, and in the second half, we'll focus on the results and some interpretations and discussions. So the method will be a little more technical. The first part will be a little more technical. And at the end of this first part, I'm hoping with time will permit that I can insert some just basic statistical concepts, just for those who might not be as familiar with it or need a refreshing from their old school days or something on that. And it will help for understanding the analysis and some of the discussions that we're going to have later in the second part. And I call that my flash course. So it's not a crash course, it's a flash course. It's going to be very fast and rapid fire, and basically cover maybe about 10 minutes toward the end of this first part of the session.
Okay.
So the first thing I'd like to do is just lay out some of the basic features of the method that are used in very broad context, and then we'll zero in on more of the details of the algorithm itself, how they actually accomplish it. So the fundamental problem in this kind of research is to find a set of features about author style that can be quantified. And as we mentioned earlier, and there's two sort of things that happen in this algorithm that make it, I think, outstanding. And I mean outstanding, meaning a little bit different than maybe a lot of other kind of analyses. One is the fact that to do this, it turns out you're going to need machine learning techniques in your software. So the machine itself that you use, the computer program in this case, has to have the ability to analyze, learn, and then try again. Analyze, learn, and try again. Because we're going to see that this involves searching for the right set of parameters upon which to base your analysis. And that's the first part of this process, is to do that. So that's one thing. The other thing is we have limitations in this analysis, and the limitations for us are severe because we're dealing with first and second century sources. And anybody that knows about history knows that literature from this period is, shall we say, sparse and compared to modern day, very sparse, you know. Mm. So we have limited resources statistically to work from. And so this is a big deal. And so what we have to do is, at the very least, what is required, the minimal requirement, is that whatever author is going to be considered for the book of Hebrews has to have already written some other works. That's it. That's a fundamental limitation. If the author of Hebrews only authored the book of Hebrews, we will never find him by this method. Yeah. It'd be impossible, you know. So we have to look to people in the ancient world who have written things, because that's the raw material from which we will make our comparison and then determine, could they have authored the book of Hebrews? Okay. Right.
Nope.
Another thing is the identification of the author for a text is, of course, based on, in this case, statistical characteristics of style. In other words, things that can be analyzed statistically that are not known to the author. So this cannot be manipulated by the author. The author, even if they wanted to, could not game the system.
Right. They can't plagiarize. Or mimic.
Mimic, yeah, exactly. It's very difficult. That's correct. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the key, right? Because you could have somebody in the ancient world try to do that, right? They could try to say, "Oh, I've read a lot of Paul. Maybe I'll try to write this like Paul," and that is very difficult to do. It turns out very difficult to do, and this analysis can get at just that kind of question. Because really, an author's style, if you get down to the most fundamental elements, and that's what we'll be searching for, what are the fundamental elements of style here? It turns out it's as good almost as a fingerprint on your hands. You just can't fake it. And so this is good. And not only that, but this style seems to hold consistent over all genres of his works and over time. And so, and this, by the way, has been somewhat established on more modern works, because this analysis has been carried out on works, let's say, of the last few centuries, where we have a lot more material, both from the authors and maybe from a group of authors. And when this has been applied to make decisions about the authorship of unknown text, they can come up with very fine, detailed, and very precise results with this method. So it's telling us, the method is sound. In other words, the method is really sound. And our limitation is not going to be so much method-based as it is going to be just simply information-based. How much information do we have to work with? The algorithms that is used to determine style is based on quantifiable aspects of three different approaches that are used from literary analysis on texts. And they are the lexical approach, which deals often with things that are very mundane and very simple and basic, such as frequency of words, or how often certain letters and combinations of letters, come to the fore, things of that nature. And these things are easily quantifiable, because you can, even a relatively inexperienced programmer could probably design a program that would, if the text is digitized, put in digital form, could could recognize those things and then count them, right?
Mhm.
So that's pretty easy. That's the easy one to deal with. The next is syntactic in nature, and this deals with issues of styles of punctuation and frequency of punctuation. Particularly, I think placement of commas would be where there's a lot of freedom. People's use of commas can vary considerably in a text. And also things like grammatically distinct words, meaning here like nouns, verbs, particles, articles, prepositions. How often do those occur in the text? Things of that nature, because people vary a lot in their use of these categories. And then finally, on the much bigger picture, the structural nature of the document, the overall textual organization and length, the number of sentences and paragraphs, maybe even the number of sentences that compose a typical paragraph, things of that nature. Notice, by the way, I leave out the word content here. And in fact, content is something that actually in this analysis, generally speaking, you want to avoid because you could have the same author writing about two different things, right? Mm-hmm. And his style or his content style, let's put it this way, then, in other words, the kind of words he uses to talk about these items could differ dramatically for a single author. So content is not basically the kind of thing that people want to do in this kind of analysis. They avoid it. They try to look for, in fact, the words that are going to select, as it turns out, to analyze, are going to be words that are common and non-contextual. That's what they're going to use. And they're going to use the lexical approach, that simple approach I talked about at the beginning, the basic, that's the best. That works the best. It works better than the other two. And so they're going to look at word frequencies of very common words like of, the, because, if we were doing this in English, since, while, who, what, all these kinds of words that come up frequently in speech and in writing, and they're going to look at how often do these words occur in the document. And then what they will do is they will set up a whole set of words. And the set will be, comprised of a certain number of words, of common words that they have determined work the best for this kind of analysis. So in a simple example, a set would be looking something like, if I had a 3-word set, I could use of, the, and because, let's say, as my words. Right. And then what I would do is I'd go through the document, do all the counting of occurrences, and then I'd get a number for each of those words that represented a frequency. In fact, divide by the total words in the document, and you have a fraction or a frequency of occurrence for that word. So that's your basic data. The problem is that we don't know a priori what is the best set of words. We don't even know, how many a priori is the optimum number of words to use. And that's where the fun is. That's where the real work is to try to determine that set. So the first part of the analysis is to try to get to the point where you can settle on what are the right words to use. We know that the right words have to fall into this category of the, say, the most common words and the words that you can use in any context. So it doesn't require any special jargon or anything like that. So that's what you have to do. And that is an involved process. And I'm sure that if I were to hazard a guess, that 90% of the analysis went into just this part of the exercise, was to determine that set. And really, by the time they got that determined, the rest of it was probably just largely a cleanup operation, So this is what we're dealing with. So there's a lot of trial and error, and this is where the machine learning comes in. And so this is a classic problem, actually, that's been around for quite a while in statistical analysis and computer science is called the optimization process. How do you optimize to get the best set of words? In that, by the way, you might think sometimes the most frequently used word would be, your best choice. Like, I'll take the word the because it's an article, right? Mm-hmm. And it's a pretty common word, right, in English. Yeah. And I'll speak in English terms just for the sake of the audience rather than going into the Greek. But the is an article that's associated with, most times a noun appears, basically in a sentence, the will accompany it, or a will accompany the article, the definite article or indefinite article. So that's going to come up frequently in a text. But the problem is it's almost too frequent. It's like it saturates. Everybody uses the, and everybody uses it a lot.
Yeah.
And so it wouldn't surprise me if the is not included in the sample. I don't know specifically which words were, but if I had to hazard a guess, I would guess that the probably did not appear just because of that fact. So this is meant to be an illustration how sometimes you have to even be more careful of using commonly occurring words because they're not distinguishing the author enough, to be useful in the analysis.
Yeah. On this, we do a Google search, the quality of our question is going to yield the quality of results that we get.
Yes.
So there's that part. The other part is, I just think I have a simple question here, and that is, when we look at the lexical, syntactic, and structural parts of the analysis, these are things that we're going to use in the qualitative research side too. In fact, there's programs that are going to bring these things out. I think maybe in the qualitative side, where we could get into trouble is when we start to, through our own reasoning, human reasoning, to see the connections between phrases or thought patterns, those things might be, where I think that the quantitative analysis is, first of all, rid of our biases and just give you the data.
That's right.
That's
huge, isn't it? That's huge.
Of course it is huge. Yeah. We tend to see what we want to see.
Yes, that's right.
But I also wonder if it's the nature of the question. If the nature of the question is who wrote the book of Hebrews, I wouldn't want to get my feels too involved in that. But at the same time, if I'm looking for kind of this theological, spiritual analysis, maybe there's more of this is where I need to now take the data that I'm seeing and see if I can make the connections that way. So the nature of your question itself about writing the book of Hebrews would want rid of the feels. Yeah. Okay, I'm just working through. Is that? No,
that's right. That's right. You're right. I think you're really certainly close in your expression to the problem. And by the way, in this analysis, what my philosophy is to do both in some sense, but have the quantitative inform the qualitative, if you will. So for me, doing the quantitative analysis and keeping it pure, if I can use that term, keeping it free is really important because then it can stand alone as a benchmark in the analysis to which we can reference. So it becomes to me, a sure point of reference. Because as we go on in our story, as you know, there's an interesting wrinkle to this story that does involve history. It does involve aspects that are not quantitative, but they're actually important for us better understanding why the result came out the way it did. And so see, that's a little interaction between what you're talking about, where the qualitative's informing the quantitative, but it's not informing it in a way to distort the nature of the quantitative analysis. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah. See that's what you want to do in something like this. So yes, I believe that we can't get rid of, content totally, because there are people that the way that they wrote and the way they express content, we know from a spiritual dimension is very important. Like with Paul, particularly because he wrote about so many things. You realize a number of things that he addressed in his epistles. It's enormous, Yeah. And so you have to kind of let that inform. And basically, what I try to do is I ask the question: well, how well do these two things match? Do they match? If there's a match, well, that's good. But just as long as you keep the purity of the quantitative, because that can really serve as kind of a hard basis of evidence that cannot be challenged. So it's a good reference point in which to link everything to, if that makes sense.
Yes. I have one more question, and I'll let you go again. The question is, at some point we interpret the data. It's been a while since I have read that particular article, but it does seem that it weighs heavily for a Pauline authorship of Hebrews, and the data is it's there. It looks like it's pretty evident. And so they're just like, when they interpret it, basically what they do at the end is say, well, that's what the data says. What can we do?
What
it is.
Yeah, that's right.
I think in the, on the qualitative side, some questions, the final result doesn't always, allow us to interpret the findings in that clear of a way. When I read the article, it seems like, it ends up being pretty clear.
Mm-hmm.
So is that the bottom line in this situation? Is that
Yes, no,
quantitative analysis just yields this result, and there's just no other way you can interpret the data?
Yeah, especially as long as you have to interpret it carefully, I think, and you always have to be, in statistical analysis, there's never 100%, but you can get sometimes in the high 90s%, and that's significant, right? If somebody told you that something was 95% likely, I think you'd probably bet on that.
Yeah,
You'd
sure.
probably say, yeah, of course, that's pretty strong. I mean, 1 out of 20, it could be wrong. It's not bad, for everyday things. Now, in science, we set a higher criteria. In physics, in fact, the criteria is pretty high. If you're going to come up with a new positive result, you have to establish that at a point statistically that the possibility of it being a false positive, okay, is about 1 in 2 million. Do you know that? 1 in 2 million chances.
I did not know that.
Yes, that's the new standard.
Well, that's very certain.
Yeah, that's right. That's 1 in 2 million. It's like, do I fly on an airplane, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we're talking about.
Sure.
Right? The probability of crash is about at that level. So you have to, in everyday parlance, we don't have the freedom to necessarily make our decisions with that kind of certainty, but we still try to factor in the relative certainty of certain things happening and not happening, or being true or not being true. And certainly, I think the criteria of, if you get in the high 90s in this kind of work, I'd even take the low 90s.
Sure.
Now you're at a point where you can really see, what you can say is the data are trending a certain way. They're pointing us in a certain direction. What limits us in going further could be just simply the lack of information that we have. And so what we have to do is we have to backfill that just a little bit with other things to then make our final assessment as to whether we think this is likely or this other thing is more likely. So now in the method, the text, what they have to do, and this is where what I call sampling, I'll use that term a lot. And what sampling means is it has to do with the amount of data you have. Because and you can I just use that because it's a nice single expression that most people will use in this discipline to represent how much data, how many data points, in other words, are we dealing with here, and it's limited, okay, and a lot of decisions, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the second part, go into making this kind of decision, and I'm sure that this was thought through very carefully, and the analysis seems to bear out to me, when I look at it, that they got pretty close to the right number here, in terms of how they divided things out. Because what they want to do is they have a single work, let's say by an author, and maybe it's a long work, fairly lengthy work, and they don't want one data point, because one data point's not too good, right? But what do you do with one data point? Mm-hmm. But if you split it up, if you parse it into sections, you can create more data points out of that one data point. And since it's a fairly extensive document they're dealing with, there's some value into that for two reasons. One is you get now, in this case, 4 data points instead of 1, which statistically works better in the analysis. But you also learn something about that single document, right? If you parse it and the 4 at random and the 4 data points kind of converge closely together, you've got evidence that this is a uniform work, meaning it's probably authored by one individual. That's huge, right? Yeah. How many questions in the New Testament we would like to have answered? Was this authored by one individual, or was this a committee work, of some kind? Yeah. And so you get these sort of incidental byproducts out of this analysis by doing these kinds of things. That's very useful. And so what they decided was the number 4 seemed to be the optimum. And looking at what they're dealing with, as I'll explain in the second part, I think I agree. I think 4, somewhere around that number, is about right. And so that's the sample size that we're ultimately dealing with when we come to actual textual material. By the way, we'll refer to these as units or textual units. That's a term I will use for it, because I don't want people to think that the 4 data points are necessarily individual documents. They're not. They're amalgamated together, and then they're parsed. And they want to try to even them out, because it turns out if you can make the units more similar, you don't have to worry as strongly about issues of unequal weighting and, this kind of thing, which can diminish the quality of the analysis if it goes too far. If you unweight too unequally, then you get into questions about, well, how well is this optimization algorithm even going to work, So for that reason, they have to kind of choose a right number. And I'm sure that there was a fair amount of time spent on that decision, actually, what to do there.
Okay.
The machine learning also occurs through trial and error, as we mentioned. And one of the things you have, I think the number of words that were in their list in Greek to use for this analysis. So this is, as I understand it, the total set, not necessarily the total number of words used, which I don't recall on this analysis that they even gave us that number, but it's some large, decent number, like in the 20s or 30s or 40s. But the numbers on their list was around 100 Greek words. So they took sort of the top 100 Greek words that they regarded as basic, non-contextual words, that are used. And from that, they drew their sample. Now think about this. Just think of the combinatoric issues involved in this. You're choosing from 100 words, trying to come up with a data set. The number of combinations that you would have to try if you tried them all would be astronomical.
Yeah.
Huge. I mean, we're talking billions, trillions, maybe, it's a large number, because you're dealing with factorials. And if you remember your math about factorials there, Trevor, the factorial is a function that grows very rapidly. So 4 factorial is 24, 5 factorial is 120, 6 factorial, 720. Look how it's growing, right? You get to a fairly low number of factorials, which are used to determine the number of combinations. Those numbers are already astronomical. Go compute 20 factorial, which is 20 times 19 times 18 times 17 times, work it down and you'll see it's a very large number. And here we're dealing with potentially, let's say 100 words as a possible part of our sample. So you've got a lot of combinations to try. And this is probably, I suspect, one of the big reasons why it hasn't been possible until relatively modern times to even do this kind of analysis. So we talked about optimization, which means finding the optimum, finding the best, and this is really a twofold problem. We have to first determine the identification of match and get the best algorithm that does that, author to Hebrews, another author to Hebrews, that kind of thing. And then we also have to discriminate the authors themselves. We have to make sure we get sufficient, what I like to call separation between the authors. And there are ways to do this. There are ways, things that you can do mathematically to the data set that will optimize if you will, the spread of the data between authors such that, and simultaneously, this is what you're looking for, the collection of works that are associated with the author form a very tight cluster of points. In other words, they're very close together, as you would expect for a single author. And the distance between authors is very large. If you accomplish both of those aspects, now you have an algorithm that can be useful. Now you have an algorithm that can actually do something for you. Because if you have two authors too close together, what will happen is you compare them to Hebrews, and Hebrews will say, well, both of them can work. But we know that's wrong. There's no way that two authors, unless two authors compose the book, there's no way that two authors should score anywhere close together in relationship to Hebrews if the algorithm is sound. So what you want to do is you want to separate them with respect to each other, and you can do that if you choose the right words and the right number of words. See, that's the assumption, is if you make the right choice, there are ways that you can accomplish that objective. And we'll see in the data, it appears that they did accomplish that objective.
So for the everyday person, we always hear of people going onto YouTube and all of a sudden they're getting recommended videos that magically are things they want to see. So my guess is, based on your past clicks, you are creating a data set for YouTube, Google.
Yes.
They are seeing where does that cluster
Yes.
happening kind of behind the scenes. You don't know what's happening.
That's correct.
Right. And once they find that data cluster for you, then they begin recommending other videos.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's a good, I think that's a good application of that. What you could do in a very different context for this kind of analysis.
Well, I guarantee you, most of my viewers are more familiar with the algorithm as associated with YouTube.
Oh, absolutely. Right. Absolutely. Yeah, they are. Yeah. And say, wouldn't it be nice if they knew more?
I know, right?
Hence our podcast today. You'll get a little more insight, even if it's applied to a very different problem. But you'll start to, and hopefully, I'm kind of hoping that some people will catch fire with this and decide maybe I need to learn more about this, and it's not too late.
Yeah,
and it would be to your benefit, to all of our benefit, if you did.
Okay.
So now the last thing I'd talk about in terms of the algorithm, before I get into my flash course, is the multiple discriminant analysis. I'm going to focus on that because that's really the principal engine, if I can call it that, statistical engine that is used in this case. And what it does is it looks at the deviations in each set of word frequency. So you have this, this set of words, and you have numbers associated with each word in the set that represents a frequency of occurrence. And what you want to do with this is you want to create a function that you can use to evaluate this set of words. And the function that's used in the MDA, as it's known, is actually fairly simple. They kept that part of it simple. It's basically a multilinear function of sorts that puts in the deviations. They refer to these as discriminants because they discriminate. Any deviation discriminates, doesn't it? If it's not identical, it means there's a difference, and that difference might be significant. And they're adding up the differences in all these word frequencies, and they're trying to give an assessment of how it compares author to author, and then ultimately the author to Hebrews. And so what you do is you have to go through, you have to have some free parameters that are called weighting factors in this kind of analysis that you can manipulate. And it's not a bad thing to do, to weight the words in this case at this level of the analysis, because what you don't know a priori is how truly significant is this word versus another word in context to these two specific authors or to this group of authors. You see, you don't know that. It's a complete unknown. So what this analysis does when you build in this kind of variable in the weighting, and then what you do is you kind of play with that. You let the computer go and assign various combinations of weightings and see how it works. You are going to find the optimum set of weighting that seems to work the best. And the belief is that this is going to actually reflect, in some sense, the proportion of significance that each word in the sample carries. That's how I understand it. Okay. So there is a meaning to it. It's not arbitrary. And statistically, when we apply this to other things, that seems to work. In other words, it gives results that consistently bear out. And so there is experience in this field because actually this field didn't develop these techniques. It was, a lot of them were around before. So there's been some use of things at least closely akin to what they're doing here that give us guidance that this is the right thing to do, that this actually does work. And so the set is comprised of, it turns out there are 7 functions that are used for reasons I'll get into in part B, but there's 7 of them. They construct these functions, they determine the number of words, they determine the words themselves, and then they just go through this repeated process of trial and error to see which gives the best results. And the best results here will be that for individual authors, they coalesce fairly tightly in their cluster of values. And between authors, they are well separated. And we'll see that. So I want to emphasize that point. And that's what the MDA does very, very well.
So, Gary, you keep using this word a priori that some people might not know what that is. Could you tell us how are you using that?
How I understand it? Yes. So a priori means that there's no principle outside of just trial and error in this case. I'll just relate it directly to this for determining the answer to what's the best set. In
Okay.
other words, you can't come up with a theory or some sort of classification scheme or anything like that that's going to determine that before you even do the trial and error. You're going to have to do the trial and error to get to that point.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. In my field, I see the word used like that, but it's always a little bit nebulous depending on what the author is using it. But
Yeah.
anyway, thank you, everyone. It's grateful
No
that you
problem.
explained that.
And the second algorithm that's used, but I won't say much about it, is because it's used kind of as an adjunct to the MDA. And so the results you see will be the multiple discriminant analysis part. But this is an interesting approach, that what's called the support vector machine is the term they use in the paper for it, SVM. But this engine is what's called a binary classifier. It's a yes, no. It just gives you a yes, no.
Okay.
You know, is this likely? Is this not likely? Does this belong to the set? Does this not belong to the set? You know, and that can be used to refine some of the analysis of the MDA. The advantage of it is that it uses more advanced statistical functions to make that decision, but it's also more limited in what it can decide. But it's still nevertheless useful in the analysis, and it does come up a little bit in this article. My impression from what the authors state is that the MDA was the main thing in this. And one other thing I'd like to say about the details of the algorithm is what's called the leave one out cross-validation. So in the article, it's LOOCV, right? You read this thing and it's an acronym for that process. They refer to it a few times, but it's very simple to understand. What they're saying is they want to find some way to evaluate the efficiency at which the algorithm identifies a correct author and says yes to it and no to an incorrect author, right? What's the efficiency of that?
Yeah.
Because that really is an independent test that you need. And the way that you do that is you have these 4 units for a single author. So you can pull one of the units out and pretend it's the unknown. Do the analysis on the other 3 and then compare it to the unknown and see how close it matches. And so you go through that process and you do it round robin. You do it for every single unit in the sample. And so you get a number of combinations, and then you try to evaluate the efficiency. And then, of course, they have 8 authors that they will be looking at, and they do it for all 8 authors. So the data set of efficiency isn't just determined from the single author, it can be determined from the entire set. So by the time you look at all the possible combinations of this and you evaluate it, you can get a pretty decent measure of how often does it get it right versus how often does it get it wrong. And it turns out that the analysis here suggests that they can, even for these ancient texts, which have very limited stats, they can get numbers in the low 90 percentile range. So that's, I think, pretty good given the circumstances. So about 90% of the time plus, a little more than that, they get it right. And the other times they get it wrong. And that turns out to be good enough for this analysis when you look at the analysis as a whole.
Interpret thinking through this, it might be helpful for our listeners that I think it was Immanuel Kant that came up with this idea of schema. Basically, it's the way that your brain categorizes certain things. And he said something like, hey, think about a cat and a dog. What's the difference?
Yeah.
And you and I, we can see a cat, know it's a cat. We can see a dog, know it's a dog. But amazingly, machines have a hard time doing that.
That's correct.
Have the little furs and the ears and the tail, and machine learning has gotten better in that. So what they'll do is they'll do the same type of thing. Is they'll show the machine, here's cats, here's dogs, learn what these are, and then they'll test it to see how often they can get, like, that's a cat, that's a cat, that's a cat. If it calls a cat a dog and that's wrong, then it's a problem. It has to relearn that. So
that's exactly right. That's kind of what's happening here in a sense, except now we can do it. Your data that you're talking about, you probably, trying to quantify all the features of a cat and dog that you're looking at, right? That's the hard part. And that's why pattern recognition is what that field is called that you mentioned. It's been a challenging field for computer science for a very long time for that very reason. So in our case, fortunately, because author style has these characteristics at a sort of rudimentary base level that are distinguishing,
Mhm.
That's huge. That means now we can avoid some of the, the issues of pattern recognition that we would normally have in the example you posed. And we can go right to the heart of the data and say, okay, this should be in principle clear cut in
Okay.
principle. And by the way, I think with more data, it would be very clear cut. Again, it's the data that limit us here. So with that as an introduction, now I've given you the sort of a summary of the algorithm. I want to just give you my flash course in statistics a little bit here, because all these things I'm going to talk about have some bearing on the analysis. At the very least, what will help the viewers, if they just hear the terminology once used in reference to something, it will help them later when we go into the actual analysis of the data more fully in the next part.
Okay.
So the first thing I'm going to talk about, and I have a slide in front of me, the nature of the distribution of data. This is a very fascinating subject. I could go on an hour on this, why this happens, but we won't do that. But it is something that for some people, when they first encounter, could be counterintuitive. We believe that when we make measurements, there's a random element, right, to making any kind of measurement. And, it just has to often do with the person. You go out and take a ruler, right, and measure the length of a table, right?
Mhm.
You have to set the ruler down right. You have to look at it from the right angle. You have to be able to read the ruler properly, right? All of these factors go into a measurement that a person is making that most people are not aware of, that have within each individual stage a little wiggle room. It's not perfect. So as a result, if you did a measurement, and people who do measurements often enough know this, you never get the same number exactly twice. And even approximately, you may not get it twice,
Mhm.
pardon me. And so this process, just very naturally, human measurement has a relative uncertainty to it, which means as you go to measure a value and then you want to catalog these values, you want to keep track of them, they won't be the same and they'll have a spread. Now, it turns out the spread isn't too large in most cases. I mean, if you're measuring a tabletop and your answer came out to be the length of a football field, you'd know something went wrong. You wouldn't even regard that data. You would know it's
Sure.
flawed and it's gone. There is, in fact, natural constraints to the measurement process, which even though the process is random, it's not random out from plus or minus infinity. You don't have the full space to work with. It is actually constrained in a real way. And that constraint leads to the distribution that's shown here, which is known as a normal distribution or Gaussian distribution for measurements of the type I just described. And by the way, there's a whole category of different types of measurements you do. Each of them have their own distribution associated with it. This is well known. This has been well studied. It's known very well mathematically, its properties. And so this gives the experimenter a huge advantage in understanding and interpreting their measurements. That's why this is so important. And so here, the normal distribution, which is a exponential function, and I'm mentioning that because some people may have a hazy idea of what an exponential function is. It's something that grows very rapidly, right? And you'll notice if you look at this curve that you have a peak to the curve. This curve is symmetrical, and it tails off very rapidly off of the center point. And that is an exponential. In fact, it's an exponential where the argument is squared, so it really goes down fast. Okay, and that typically tends to be the nature of most measurements that people do on the kinds of objects I just described. And when we do it in physics, we often do it with electronic instrumentation that's very sophisticated. And of course, avoids at least the human part of the error, which is nice. And but even fancy instruments sometimes have issues as well, and you have to study very intently, like what's going on with the instrument that made the measurement to fully understand how good your value really is. And it will show a curve very much like this in many cases, although the width of the difference may be much smaller than you're accustomed to, much more finely precise than you would accomplish just on your own as a human being. So we characterize this distribution with two parameters called the mean or the average. A mean is an average. A mean is a statistical term that we generally use for the average. And it's very, most people know almost intuitively that if you take the average of a distribution, that's important. We've been doing that kind of operation actually for a very long time as human beings, kind of an average of sort. People sensed that that was the right thing to do. And now, of course, we can prove from probability theory that is the right thing to do, that the average is your best value to characterize a sample. And then you have something called the standard deviation, which measures the width. And the standard deviation in this case is actually indicated on this diagram by looking at the Greek letter mu minus sigma at the horizontal scale and mu plus sigma on the other side. And then what that does, the sigma is chosen as standard deviation. I won't go into the details of that, but it's a well-known statistical parameter that has been shown to be of great significance in statistical work. So they measure the width in terms of that parameter for that reason.
Yeah.
And the mean is something that usually is a characteristic inherently of the data. The standard deviation can be a characteristic of the data at times. There are certain circumstances where it is. It's just there's something about the process that's inherently random enough that you will never get the exact answer twice, that kind of thing. But it's also a function of the instrument that you use to measure it as well. And so those two things, that's how we associate our measurements to curves. And it's remarkable, but in a symmetric normal distribution, those two parameters are all you need. Those two things, you understand everything about the curve. So that's why, in fact, for people who've done a little statistics, even if it's been in coursework, they talk so much about mean and standard deviation, right? Because these are the keys. Those two guys, you know everything you need to know. And
well,
just briefly,
I remember that course, and I'm breaking out in cold sweats.
Yeah.
Speak. I think I'm, if that's a population, I'm probably in the mu. And in terms of IQ, you're the mu plus sigma over there.
Well, I certainly hope so. I've had enough practice.
But you know what? Yahweh has called everyday people like myself to be disciples, and we don't have to be mu plus sigma to
no, that's right.
to be a part of the group.
We have to at least be if I could use an old quote, we need to be at least above average. We can be above average. We're doing all right.
All right.
So histograms and bending the data, I'm only mentioning this. This is a fascinating subject of its own, but I just want to draw out a couple things from this because it gives histograms do not affect generally the analysis to any great degree, or they shouldn't statistically. But what they do is they give you a picture of the data you're collecting. Mm-hmm. And that picture should, in the case, it turns out, of a large sample of data. So in other words, you let the data that you accumulate be extremely large, 10,000 points, 100,000 points, something, way up there, right?
Right.
This histogram that I'm showing you here, which is just simply dropping data points in bins, they're intervals that you've established that are appropriate intervals to use for this purpose. And when the data point falls within that range, designated by that bin, which the viewer can see at the bottom along the horizontal axis. It's in units of about 0.2, I think, per bin. Then they accumulate in the bin, just like a straight line. It's kind of like a bar graph. Some people, if you're using bar graphs, you'd be familiar with this idea. So what you do is you count the number of occurrences of that particular data range, and that number is indicated at the top of these bars here. So I have an arrow that points to 7 on this diagram so people know, okay, it's a number of occurrence. Each bar is a piece of area because you have a width, you have height and a width. Width times height is an area. So it's an area on the curve, okay? And what you have is an ideal curve that you can fit over that histogram approximately. Can't fit it perfectly because it's rather jagged, but you can fit approximately. And the claim is as you increase the amount of data, this is about, I think, 100 points, if I recall, that were measured in this particular event. And say you went from 100 to 200 to 400 to 1,000 to 10,000, you start increasing the number of measurements. You would find that this histogram would exactly align out that normal distribution that we talked about. You would be able to fit it very cleanly to the histogram. So I say the ideal curve envelopes this histogram in the case where the data is extensive. The uncertainty in each value, by the way, in this histogram, and this is of some importance to our case, is the square root of the number. So let's take a number like 10 in here. Okay, 10. The square root of 10 is 3. So we're saying that that number there, 10, is anywhere from 13 to 7 with this amount of data. So, and similarly for the others, because these other bins are about the same numbers. So what it's telling you is it's a nice, pretty picture, but there's still, you would have to do a lot of samplings to even that out, because going as the square root, if I increase the number from 100, let's say to 10,000, now that uncertainty is down from, what was it before? About 30% to about 1%. You see?
Yeah.
And so now you've got something that's much better fitted to the histogram. Or I should say fitted to the ideal curve. So those are the things I wanted to highlight about this part of it, because as we go on and talk later, I'll be making reference to some of these ideas. Just point out, not all distributions are symmetrical. Some are like slanted or skewed, we call them. You know, this one's a right skewed distribution, meaning it tails out longer on the right side. There are also left side skewing as well. This one, by the way, comes very close to characterizing what's called the Poisson distribution, or the distribution associated with counting events. You take your Geiger counter and you measure radioactive counts. That's the kind of curve you want to use for that purpose, for instance. Have an example of the same average, different widths. Okay, so here's where the means agree, which means very likely drawn from the same sample. It's talking about the same thing, because it's rare when you get a perfect agreement between means, but something's different in maybe the process of measurement or the circumstances of the environment when you measured it that causes the width of one to be larger than the other. So we would say here that the smaller width sample probably represents a better measurement, a more precise measurement than the other one.
Yeah.
Well, here we have different average and different widths. And so here, one thing I wanted to point out is notice the overlap region. These overlap. And here's what's relevant to our kind of case. Let's say one of these, the sharper one, we'll call it the Book of Hebrews. Now, Hebrews is much sharper than this, by the way, but we'll call it the Book of Hebrews. The other one, the flatter one in this picture, is a author. Now, you would look at this and you would say, oh, well, look at this. There's a lot of overlap between the two distributions, which there is, and we'll in a moment relate that to a probability and the fact that the probability gets larger with the larger overlap for identifying these two different peaks as being one of the same peak. That's the idea, okay? However, because the distribution is broad, a lot of this is due to the broadness of the distribution. If we tightened up that second guy and made it narrower, it wouldn't look so good, would it? And so this is what you always face in these kinds of problems, is you're trying to always get your measurement width as fine as you can. And that's the tightness of the clustering that we were talking about, you see. So, and so here, applying this to two different authors, you can see now why the machine wants to get tightness of clustering. That's very important. And then finally, and I think I'm done here. Yes, this will be the last slide for this session. So we talk about the probability of similarity and the overlap of distributions. The area, I shaded the area of overlap so you could better see that. And the ratio of the shaded area to the total area under the curve, either curve in this case, represents a kind of probability of match. You can think of it in those terms. It's a little colloquial, what I'm saying, not as precise as I would like to be, but just for the benefit of the viewer. Just if you think of it in those terms, then you're thinking about it approximately the correct way. That is, it'll give you sort of a probability of match between those two curves. So again, we would not want a wrong author looking like this figure. We want to separate it out, make sure that the author that did not author Hebrews is in fact not given a very high probability of signature.
Okay.
Well, so that's my flash course.
Hey there, listener. If you enjoyed that 3-unit course on statistics, Gary today has a special running at $199. You can forward that to Gary.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, hey, this is some of the
gratefully take donations.
Yeah. Hey, this is background stuff that you need, in part because, if Gary and I are going to talk about the authorship of Hebrews, and, we're not just kind of pulling stuff out of the air here. This is stuff based in data that is there for anyone to view, to gather, to do a statistical analysis, and to interpret that data. And it's not just something that anyone's making up here. We're grateful that there's been some work done in this area. In other words, some of the outcomes that Gary will talk about isn't research that he did directly, but it's a article that we're going to link, and that there's other there's works like this continuing to be developed. And the thing is, how do we understand all this? Now, I do understand that there's a segment of the population, well, and they're not here anymore because they tuned out about minutes. It didn't even take a minute. But if you're still here, hopefully you realize that if we're going to understand Torah, walking in Torah, understand Jesus, and do all this responsibly, it isn't that we're just making it up. We've got to deal with the biblical text responsibly, and that's what we're seeking to do. This part right here, we're going to call it 3A. We're going to take a break here. The next video, I'll post these both at the same time, and I'll see you over in the next video on Everyday Torah.